Hi, Steve.
Hey, Jim.
So wait, hold on. Do you hear that?
Hear what?
That music.
Yeah.
Ice cream! Ice cream! The ice cream man is coming! The ice cream man is
The ice cream man is here. Welcome once again to Two Guys Talking About Records, a vinyl community podcast. My name's Jim, and I am a record store owner.
I just had to run out there. Hi, I'm Steve, and I'm a vinyl collector.
If you haven't guessed, we're going to be talking not about ice cream, although I'd love to talk about ice cream, but comedy records today on the podcast. And we'll explore some of the history of them. And believe it or not, there still are comedy records coming out today.
Yeah, Jim just surprised me with that because I didn't know. I did not know. Most of the comedians I know are dead or in jail.
Side note, before we get into this, and while I'm still thinking about it, you know that our store here is in the middle of a neighborhood, i.e. we're your friendly neighborhood record store. Yeah. So last year, the year before, I like to have the doors open on nice summer days. I heard an ice cream truck. In between song cuts, I picked up the needle and I actually went outside and said, where is the ice cream truck? But it was echoing off of the houses in the bus garage. I never found it, but there was an ice cream truck, I swear.
I grew up in a little small town, Nebraska. There was no such thing as an ice cream truck, but when we'd visit Grandma in Chicago, there would be one, and it was like the most exciting part of the whole trip. It is an ice cream truck. Wow.
So we're going to attempt to tickle your funny bone today with some comedy records. But before we get to that, as is our custom, let's take a look at some of the pickups this week because this is a vinyl community podcast. Got some goodies to talk about?
Yes. Oh, my goodness. Someone sent me 3 Iron Maiden albums.
I saw that on your video, or on your posting, not your video yet.
So I listened to Iron Maiden for the first time, took notes. I'm going to do a whole video about my thoughts on Iron Maiden.
You're not much of a metalhead, are you?
No, I'm not. I think these are like, I have a metal box set that I bought just to see what it was all about. Kind of scared me and put it away. So this was a first, but it was very exciting. I was very happy to have that.
Bigger question is, what did your neighbors think of Iron Maiden?
Yes, they're all in. My one neighbor closest to where my office is at, she can't hear anyway, so okay. It's all good. I did pick up I just brought that in. It was a Shadow Show. Someone sent this to me. Shadow Show, it's 3 ladies. They did an album called Silhouettes, and they're out of Detroit. Very pop-oriented, almost Beatlesque. Their harmonies were really incredible. I was just amazed by that album. So much fun. I'm
going to give that a listen, too. See what you think.
And Blur's Park Life. I decided to pick that up. I've been wanting that, so I picked that up. That's my favorite Blur album by far.
Cool.
And the big one. This, I could not believe I found this. Olivia Newton-John's Greatest Hits. There was a moment of weakness in my life. I don't know what happened, but I went home with that. Now, my wife was quite excited about that. Oh, we should listen. She always says, well, we should listen to this. And that's it. She's never coming into my office to say, I'd like to listen to some music. But if she did, I have that.
You have it just in case. Wherever did you find one?
I found that, Radio Wasteland has just the stuff you can't find, the rare albums that you can't find. And this is one of those rarities.
Well, enjoy it.
Well, how about you, Jim?
Oh, I had a couple of goodies come in. First up was, music on vinyl. I do enjoy their pressings, and they're kind of digging their way through the 90s a little bit with some of these and going back to things that were, very limited pressings. And this is one that I'm not quite sure. It lists it as indie rock, but I still don't know where to kind of tag that. I'm not going to call it jangle pop, but it's from Ned's Atomic Dustbin. Have you heard these guys before? This MOV just reissued Are You Normal? That's got one of my favorite Ned's songs called Intact on there too. So I picked up a couple copies, one for the store and one for me. They're not numbered. They're on kind of a bluish vinyl. But it sounds great from Music on Vinyl, of course. But I'm still having trouble assigning this. I'll call it alternative. They call it indie. I feel it's got a very small touch of industrial, but not quite industrial. What's the word I'm looking for here? If I'm trying to compare them to the Stone Roses or something from those early 90s bands. Well, regardless, they're kind of that British sound from the early 90s that the Stone Roses and Ed's Atomic Dustbin and a few others really kind of emulated. And it sounds great, and I like it, and I dig it, so I'm going to keep a MOV copy in the personal. The other one, and this goes back to our discussion on greatest hits albums and whether or not you want greatest hits. For the longest time, and I like The Cure, don't get me wrong, I really do enjoy The Cure, but their greatest hits, it's not the newer ones, but the older greatest hits, the Standing on the Beach, the singles, was good enough for me because that covered everything. Well, we had a copy of The Cure, 17 Seconds, come in. It's an original, and I'm like, I'm going to throw it on. And A Forest was different, obviously, than the greatest hits version, which is condensed. And I listened to that, and I thought, that is a great version of this. It is a European pressing from the Netherlands, so it's not a U.S. nor a U.K., but it sounds great, and I think I'm going to keep this one in the collection. And I'm still going to hold on to that greatest hits, but this is, believe it or not, this is my first non-greatest hits Cure album in the collection, and I don't know what my problem is.
Well, we go back to the OG discussion. You just got excited about that. Once again, our podcasts seem to foreshadow things that happen in our life later on.
There's got to be some sort of term for how that happens. Isn't it funny how that happens?
It is.
Hey, speaking of funny, let's segue into the funny business here. We wanted to talk a little bit about comedy albums. You'll see these things in record stores, usually in bargain bins, but almost always in their own little shelf. And, here at our store, we've got a decent little clutch of them. I'm about to put out a much larger clutch of them.
Yes.
But things that range in everything from the 50s and 60s to more, I don't want to say contemporary, but I guess the 80s are no longer contemporary for me, to more modern ones, which they actually still are pressing comedy albums, stand-up comedy albums, which surprised me today.
I was shocked when you put that because when you think about, with TV, cable, everything that's going on, YouTube, to still put out a comedy album almost seems gutsy right now.
Very much so, because why would you, and again, speaking as a vinyl guy, I'm really questioning this, but I don't think I could sit and listen to a comedy album per se when I can call that exact same stuff up on YouTube now.
I think as we go through, we're going to talk more about some albums. I mean, some comedians will work on vinyl, but some comedians, it just doesn't work nearly as well. I go back, the very first album I ever got, I'd asked my parents for the Beatles' Greatest Hits, the Red Album. This is going to be my first album ever. And so at Christmas, I can see there's a record underneath the tree, and I'm really excited. And I open this up, and it's Spike Jones. And I had no clue. My parents, they're just elated. They're so excited. Oh, he's just the funniest person in the whole world. And when you're waiting for this Beatles album, and suddenly you're looking at Spike Jones, and you don't have it's humor from the 1940s, and this is around 1971, 72. Like, I really get that, the fury is like, oh my God. It scarred me for life, but I never did throw that album away until the flood. But that was my very first record album, was a comedy album.
Now, we can kind of group comedy albums in my looking at this genre. I've kind of got them grouped into three different things. One being the more original, and we'll talk to Spike Jones, although that's music, but it's comedy. Mm-hmm. That bridges that line there. But the earlier ones tended to be radio shows, and I'm talking into the 40s and 50s and 60s. Then you get into stand-up, but that at the same time, you've also got studio-produced comedy albums. So if we split these up as in just kind of almost an audio capture of a radio show versus the stand-up routines that were very, very prevalent through the 60s, some into the 70s and 80s, but also the studio-produced ones, whether they be things like Cheech&Chong or the Firesign Theater, that popped up in the late 60s throughout the 70s, and in some cases even a little bit later with some other interesting types of that, one of which we'll talk about here, a more contemporary one from Bo Burnham. But comedy records go back as far as records go back in looking at this, and we're talking all the way into the late 1800s with comedians putting jokes on Edisons.
Yeah, burlesque was a big part.
And, vaudeville.
Yeah, vaudeville. Think of all that. And so there were so many jokes out there. And a lot of people couldn't go to that, but they had a record player, and this gave them a chance to experience it. And even when you think to a radio show. So if you miss that radio show or they played it, that was a funny episode, you may never hear that again. But this gave people a chance to relive some of those favorite, things on the radio.
One of the earliest ones that I could find that talked about being a commercial success was from OK Records, OKEH, that did a lot of shellac stuff in the 20s and 30s. You find them, they're not tremendously valuable. But this one was called The Laughing Record. The OK Laughing Record. And what it was several minutes of a man and a woman laughing. And that was it. And that sold well in the 1920s.
It was a simpler time when entertainment, we're coming up toward the Depression. We need some way to entertain ourselves. Let's just sit here and laugh.
The Discogs notes on that release says, features a man and a woman laughing uncontrollably. And that is it. It looks to be about 3 minutes long of uncontrollable laughter.
Call up the neighbor or I guess shout him, hey, gotta come over here and check out my album. It's a hoot.
You mentioned some of your first album was that Spike Jones comedy. Some of the ones that I remember early on, I don't want to call them my collection because they ended up in our family's collection, but I would get them eventually, were things like Abbott and Costello. And of course, put to vinyl, Who's on First is just as funny as just about anything you see. But again, now you can call the video up on that on YouTube in a heartbeat. But I remember having that Abbott and Costello, which I think there was other cuts from their radio shows or some other radio shows at the same time. But that was always a funny listen because you could call that up. Back then, there was no YouTube. There was no streaming that you could. And if you wanted to listen to Abbott and Costello saying third base, you had to play it on vinyl.
The movies, that was even, a part in a movie. Yep. So it gave people this chance to have this classic monologue that to this day, it's still hilarious.
Oh, it is.
Extremely funny. It's one of those timeless ones. And you think of, Burns and Allen.
Burns and Allen. Yep.
Yes.
George Burns and Gracie Allen did some of those too.
They put out a lot of different record albums from their radio bits.
Yep. Just about any radio comedian that you could think of from the 30s and into the 40s, they would transcribe that onto an album. And that would sell for folks to relive that. As you mentioned, back then, just like television, if you missed Dallas, you missed it. There was no TiVo. There was no streaming. There was no VCRs to record. And it was the same thing with radio back then. So this was a great way, as you said, to relive these older radio memories.
One of my favorite comedians, and when I bought his record, I'd seen him. He was on TV already. I didn't know that he had stand-up albums. It was Bob Newhart.
Yep.
When I bought that first album, and he does these bits where he's talking on the telephone, it translated so well to vinyl because it's not physical. It's just someone's pretending they're sitting on a phone talking. I thought it was the funny, and I still think it's so extremely funny because Bob Newhart just has that way about him where he stammers like myself, but it was fun. And wasn't that the best-selling comedy record?
Not only comedy record, it made the Billboard charts proper. The button-down mind of Bob Newhart, and that surprised a lot of people, including him. So now we're talking into the early 60s, and one of the articles I found on this was from the Journal of Antiques and Collectibles, and they did an entire post on comedy records. And they kind of split this up into eras, if you will, and they called the modern age of comedy, this coming after the vaudeville, the shellac, Victrolas, and the radio shows. We get into this era in the late 50s of not so much stand-up, but lounge acts, lounge comedy. Do you know what record label was the first to put out a lounge act, the most, what this article calls the first of the modern age comedy records?
No, I don't.
Verve Records. Known primarily for
Jazz.
Yes. So the founder of Verve Records, Norman Granz, somehow knew this comedian by the name of Mort Saul, was a fan of his or some reason, and approached him and wanted to record his routines to press on vinyl for Verve Records. So you've got this label that's a well-respected jazz label recording some of the biggest of the bigs, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Count Basie, and, Oscar Peterson, Charlie Parker. Oh, and here's a comedy record from Mort Saul called The Future Lies Ahead. And that paved the way for Shelley Berman, which then paved the way for Bob Newhart.
It's funny with that Bob Newhart when they had asked him to do like a nightclub show, and he goes, to tape it in a nightclub, correct? And he goes, well, I've never done my comedy in a nightclub before.
Exactly. So his first appearance was to record this album, which would go on to be The Button-Down Mind, a fantastic seller.
Yes, and to this day, it still holds up because he went back in history and looked at history. So the jokes were made so it wasn't just very 50s or very 60s. And yeah.
In this era, you also get some of these musical comedians coming on the heels of Spike Jones. Folks like Tom Lehrer, for example, who was a pianist, and he would find some social commentary in his songs, and that's what made them comedy. You can go back, and they're a little dated, but some of them, man, they come true today as well. If you find some Tom Lehrer stuff where he's singing about politicians or science or discoveries of that nature, or just social commentary about race and racism. The stuff that he was singing about in the 60s seems almost a little touchy today, but it's like, holy cow, this guy is kind of hitting it on the head. But that falls into this line of musical comedy.
I grew up in the 60s. My parents, we had all the Bill Cosby albums. And Bill Cosby was just the funniest man in the world. We would play those over and over. Now, as I got older, it's like a lot of comedy albums I would never play over and over. But Bill Cosby had such a way of telling a story. Now, of course, with all his troubles, like, those like taboo, can you listen to him? The fact is, he did tell incredible good stories about childhood, and it would take you back. And a lot of my fondest memories are listening to these. And I just remember the whole Noah routine where God's talking to him, trying to convince him to build an ark. And, that was so powerful that after the flood, the only albums that survived totally untouched, unscathed by water was Bill Cosby. Every single one of his albums were in perfect shape. Don't know why. Can't explain it. It might have been Noah, but there it is.
I do remember that story, and they were sandwiched between others that were ruined.
Yes, they were. And there's Bill Cosby. What the heck?
It's a miracle. So let's move on to the risky 60s is what this article is calling this next era of comedy, where you get into someone by the name of Richard Pryor. And you want to talk about pushing some buttons. Pryor and the likes of Lenny Bruce as well really began to push that social commentary in a way that was different than Tom Lehrer would, touching on subject matter that Bill Cosby and Bob Newhart probably could not or would not, each from their own perspectives. But Pryor, more than anything, coming from his lineage as an African-American and a comedian, could really talk about things in a way that no one else at that time could.
He was looking for his own, it's like music. You try to find, where do I fit in? How will I stand out from the rest? And he found his shtick. This is where I want to be, and I'm going to kind of push. And what happened? He got the young people now listening. So all the college kids, the Newhart, Cosby, that is my parents. We need our own comedian.
And that's where Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor come in.
Yeah.
One of my earliest memories of listening to a Richard Pryor routine was it had to be either late middle school or early high school, because I was still riding a school bus. And so this would have put it in the late 70s, 78, 79 era. And one of my friends had snuck on a cassette copy of a Richard Pryor album, and we sat in the back of the bus. And we were listening to this, and I remember being scared to death, because if we got caught listening to Richard Pryor, on this cassette, we could get sent to the principals. I'm not kidding either. You're listening to this very subversive stuff. You could get in trouble for that. And so we laughed and we oh, shh, don't let anybody know we're listening to Richard Pryor in the school bus.
And it made it twice as funny, didn't it? Just
Yes.
for the fact.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's just like, it did. You know what? The joke could have sucked. It didn't matter because this was subversive.
Very much so. Lenny Bruce, I got to admit, I'm not very up on Lenny Bruce and his history and everything that happened. That's been on my my list of reading that I want to get to and learn a little bit more about him. But that's always kind of escaped me. But I know that there are a lot of Lenny Bruce albums out there. I mean, short of him being, if you want to compare him to Jim Morrison and for getting arrested for doing his art, that's Lenny Bruce.
Yes. And he would just push that, just to see, will you arrest me or not?
Yep.
Here we go.
Now, one of the other types of comedy records that we talked about was the studio produced. Mm-hmm. And in the early 60s, along with some of these other more subversive acts coming up, as well as the more traditional, you get a comedian by the name of Bob Booker. Now, I see this album everywhere coming in batches of used vinyl, and this is one called The First Family. Originally released in 1962, this was a studio-produced comedy album, so no audience. It was all skits cut right to vinyl. That was a parody of the Kennedy family in the White House.
I'm pretty sure I had. In fact, I know I had that album, and I never listened to it. It was. You're right. You can still find that everywhere.
Oh, yeah. There's 2 or 3 of them here.
But there's reasons.
Yes.
Go ahead and explain what happened. What killed his career?
This was a big seller because of Camelot and just the infatuation with the Kennedy family. Folks loved them. They loved hearing about them. Even the comedy side of it, making more light of the Kennedy family, was a big deal in 1962. But then John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 63, and this album was actually recalled as being insensitive. The stores had to give it back. They pulled all of them away from the shelves simply because the nation was in such shock after the assassination of Kennedy that they couldn't even begin to think about laughing about that.
So you think the guy was sitting at home thinking, this is tragic what happened to the Kennedys, or going, oh my God, my whole career just disappeared. I'm going to be homeless.
In fact, I read an article where somebody asked Lenny Bruce very specifically about that. Again, Lenny Bruce, pulling no punches, shortly after the Kennedy assassination, about Bob Booker. He said, what do you think this is going to do? And he goes, well, he's screwed.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, that concept, though, was, and this is a little known, I've only seen a couple of these come through. This concept of the First Family album was resurrected again in 1981 for the Reagan family in the White House, done by none other than Rich Little, the impressionist, along with a host of other comedians. The album cover looks almost identical to the first one with the First Family and the Kennedys, but this one being Reagan with the addition of a monkey and other folks in there as well. Notable because this album features the young comedian by the name of Jenna Lee Harrison, who would go on to become not an original, but a cast member on Three's Company, the ditzy blonde character after the Chrissy left. But also featured Michael Richards, who was a brand new comedian in 81, who would go on to star in the SNL knockoff called Fridays, but then more famously would become Kramer on Seinfeld.
No kidding.
And he is on this. He's on a cover of this as well. I remember mostly from UHF as well. But, so this one didn't do as well, obviously. It's making fun of the Reagans much in the same way that Booker made fun of the Kennedys. But still kind of an interesting concept of this studio-produced comedy album. Now, on that note, there are a lot of other ones that became tremendously popular in the 60s and 70s, speaking mostly of Cheech and Chong being predominantly that studio-produced, not live. But there's others like the Firesign Theater.
Saturday Night Live put out their album, and I remember buying that, just so I could have those. Some of my favorite skits were back in there.
National Lampoon also did skit albums. The Firesign stuff is a little difficult to swallow because it's just it is out there. But the Firesign for me holds a little bit of an emotional attachment because I borrowed the name of one of their characters for my radio name for many, many years, that being their detective, Nick Danger. And so on the radio, I was Nick Danger for the for the longest time. So I do have a collection of a lot of the Fire Sign stuff, but I rarely dig to it to listen to it because it's just like, wow, what were they on? Well, I know what they were on.
Kind of like Cheech and Chong.
You know what they're on, especially the album that came with a rolling paper.
Yes, with seeds included. Yeah, they're definitely it went bigger into storytelling, but in a lot different way. It wasn't Bill Cosby storytelling anymore. But again, we're trying to appeal to what's changing. Culture's changing. Everybody, the college kids, the comedy circuit, really, the colleges were the big part of the comedy circuit. So you had to keep changing.
Now, collectability of comedy records, we're going to take a break and talk about that for a second. The early stuff, dollar bin fodder for the most part. Bill Cosby stuff, unfortunately, as funny as it is, dollar bin or less fodder. Nobody is touching that. Even the best shaped comedy albums from that era, even the radio shows, are dollar bin, $2 and $3 bins. The exceptions being that there are a few. I mentioned the Cheech and Chong with the rolling paper, Big Bamboo. You will find that occasionally with the rolling paper still intact, and that becomes a little more valuable as a collectible, but not tremendous. Maybe in the $10 to $15 range.
I think, to me, part of the problem just might be with a comedy album. Once you've played it, you know it.
Yeah.
And unless it's a really important artist to you. I said, well, Bob Newhart, I could listen to that a few times. It was just so funny. But otherwise, okay, is it as funny the second time around, third time around, fourth time around?
Well, with the Cheech and Chong, if you use the rolling paper the first time, you may not remember it, so you'd have to listen to it again.
In the very first comedy concert I went to was Steve Martin, and that was in the late 70s. And I went to that, and it was just like the funniest thing I've ever seen. So I bought his record albums, and and they had a lot of the routines from the concert. The problem with this is Steve Martin was such a physical comedian.
Yep.
It was his action, his faces, his what he was doing on stage, and so you would have, you'd listen to the album, but it just wasn't the same. Now, I mean, he sold millions of them, but you didn't have that feel.
And to some respect, I'll talk in as a radio guy as well, an old radio guy. Some of that goes to the theater of the imagination. You hear him dropping something. The Eddie Murphy skit that we opened up with, the Ice Cream Man, very famous skit from him. But again, one of the funniest parts is when he's teasing the other kid about ice cream and drops his microphone. That's visual and physical. And on the record, you hear the thump, and then you hear nothing while the character responds to the dropping of his ice cream cone. But this gets us into the 80s, a tremendously prolific time for comedy albums. It exploded with the likes of Robin Williams, Steve Martin. You get folks like Martin Mull kicking in, and anybody that comes from SNL had some of their own comedy albums popping up as well. They were everywhere.
Well, one we didn't talk about, they were started in the 70s, went to the 80s, is George Carlin.
Correct, yes.
I mean, you talk about someone that kind of changed his career as he went. He started with the hippy-dippy weatherman and was trying to find his way through, which was funny for a while, but then the kids moved on from that and it wasn't doing as well. So then he went into, which translated very well into vinyl, words.
Correct.
And that, you didn't need there's no physicality with this. You just sit there and listen to someone take a word and you go, God, that guy's right. And you could listen to this a few times because you would be, that is so funny.
Carlin also ensured with one of his most famous routines that his act would never be played on the radio. I'm talking, of course, of his 7 dirty words that you can't say on the radio. So I won't go through them now because we're still trying to get a good rating on the podcast. You know what that is. You know what they are.
Yes.
But that's another one of those things. He was being subversive and saying that this is the only place you're going to hear this is on my record right now.
And now he became popular again back in the colleges. And this was, I think, in the 80s. He was moving into all of these albums. I mean, and this whole new routine that brought him back to the forefront once again of comedy in going forward. Because you're right, the 80s was crowded. There was so many comedians out there doing stuff because this was a way to make money. Bob Newhart kind of opened the door up to say you can make a lot of money by doing comedy albums. Now, not everyone did, but boy, by the 80s, I bought all kinds of comedy albums then.
And also you've got the VCR coming into play in the 80s as well, which now all of a sudden you could get bootleg versions or initially buy some comedy routines from these artists. So that, I think, signals, I don't want to call it the beginning of the end, but it definitely changed the landscape for comedy albums by the time you get to 83, 84, 85.
They had, what Comedy Central came about?
Yep.
Talk about there. MTV would bring in the comics at times. It was more fun to watch them and physically, see them on the TV than just spinning a record. And I know the radio guy says, but that's where, you're imagining this. Well, let's face it, by the mid-'80s, our imagination was dead. We just want to see it and look at it because we like music videos.
And laugh at them again. This, though, brings up the fact that we have now moved into a more contemporary age with comedy. You've got biggies like Dave Chappelle really kind of plowing things forward, but those are all video-based, streaming especially based, where he does a lot of these. But there are some contemporary comedians that are putting their stuff out on vinyl. John Mulaney was another one from just a few years back that became very popular and put his act on vinyl. Now, I don't have any stats as to how well that sold, but I've not seen them come in as used. But one of the ones that's most intriguing to me was from the lockdown era of the past couple of years, and a comedian by the name of Bo Burnham. During the lockdown, this gentleman who has got some tremendous video skills and storytelling and songwriting skills created a special which would ultimately stream called Inside, meaning that he's locked inside. And I'm very hesitant to call this a comedy album because if you watch it, yeah, it's funny in spots, but it's also some really biting social commentary surrounding the lockdown, what he's watching, what he's hearing, what he's experiencing, what he's fearing more than anything. So technically that's labeled as a comedy album, and it spawned a special that was very popular streaming, and they have created multiple variations of the vinyl of this special as well, but it's mostly songs and a little bit of commentary that kicks throughout there. It's labeled under comedy, and for purposes of our discussion today, we'll talk about this as a contemporary comedy album.
FaceTime with my mom tonight. Okay, that's good. Sexting. Okay, yeah. Bezos too. Yeah. There's some pretty good stuff. So would we put Weird Al Yankovic?
That's a great question. His is parody stuff. I compare that with the Dr. Demento, which is a comedy show.
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah, the Weird Al Yankovic albums go in comedy as far as their listings is in a store like ours when we have them. Mm-hmm. That's comedy, but that goes back to Spike Jonze.
Yes, it does. Yeah, very, very true. It pops right back in. Spike Jonze is still out there.
The overriding push of our entire conversation here, though, is how often can you listen to a comedy record? Now, the thing with Bo Burnham and his Inside, I saw the special. I was impressed by the way that he created it, and I will admit some certain amount of creative genius went into it, but it's not something that I'm going to listen to over and over again because A, it reminds me of the lockdowns, and B, it's funny, but it's not funny. But once you hear it once, where do you go?
And that does become the thing with comedy albums. It's too many of them. Once you hear it once, you put it away, you shelve it, and there it will stay forever. Yeah, I'm Bill Cosby, I listened to over and over. George Carlin, I could listen to over and over. Steve Martin, I really didn't. And I saw him. I love the man. And I saw saw him in concert. But it just wasn't the same as some of them.
And from a vinyl collector standpoint, that comedy album takes up a spot in the collection. That could be something else. Yeah,
with my second collection, I rarely buy a comedy album. It's just not worth it for me, which is again why they're like $1, they're 50 cents. Yeah, it's very cheap. It comes, to me again, does it translate? Robin Williams, I don't think he's funny, but it doesn't translate as well. Monty Python, think about those comedies.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they're very visual. It's funny on the album, it's enjoyable, but it doesn't translate as well as seeing that sketch when they're dressed up as women.
Yep.
It's totally different. Richard Pryor, again, he does on album, but boy, to see him in a concert, that's even better.
Very visual. And that's the point with this Bo Burnham Inside. It's a very visual thing as well. It's cool that it's been translated, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
So, do you have fun?
I had fun. That actually was pretty funny. Yes, the ice cream truck, though, kind of waiting for that sucker to come around.
I think I hear it. All right, we got to go, folks. Bye. Have a good week.
Yeah.